The first step in making bourbon is to feed yeast. Yeast are very simple microorganisms. They can only eat about 5 things. They can eat table sugar, which is sucrose, and then there's 2 simpler sugars that come together to make table sugar, and that's glucose and fructose. They can also eat something called maltose and another very simple sugar called dextrose. It's kind of like a right-handed version of glucose. That's all yeast can eat. Plants have babies, right? And their babies are the little corn kernel and the wheat kernel. And the mama plant has to save some sugar to give her babies so that they can put down some roots, put up a stem, open some leaves, and then the kid can kind of take it from there, right? Because photosynthesis. Until the baby plant has leaves open, it's dependent on this little bit of sugar that the mother plant gives it. The thing is, mother plants can't put simple sugars into those seeds because everything on earth can eat those simple carbohydrates. So what the plant does is it chains those carbohydrates into long branching chains, and we call those starch. So that's all starch is, which is a whole bunch of sugars all chained together, which might change your view of a bowl of noodles, but it doesn't stop me. So what we're going to do in the mashing process is we're gonna break down that starch that's in the corn kernel and the wheat kernel, and we're gonna break it down in 3 different ways. The first thing we're gonna do is break it down mechanically by grinding it in our mill. And her name is Baby. And we'll feed that grain into Baby. Baby will crush it and pulverize that grain so that the water can get into it. We're then going to cook it in hot water, and that's gonna cause a process called gelatinization. And that's where water will surround all of those starches. And if that's all we did, we would end up with my nightmare scenario, which is every week, I'm afraid we'll end up with 12,000 pounds of polenta. But what we're going to do also is we're going to add an enzyme. And you can think of this like a little set of chemical scissors. And those are derived from malted barley, which is barley that's allowed to sprout and it's dried. And so we'll use those barley enzymes and they will chop those starches up into simple sugars that the yeast can then metabolize. So during that mashing process, we're cooking that grain, we're developing some flavor from that cooking process, we're breaking down those starches, and we're creating the mash that we're then going to feed to the yeast.
So we mashed everything, got all those sugars, kind of got all that together, and then it's yeast selection. So over thousands of years, humans have started selecting different yeast, and all the yeast we use today, from brewing to baking to distilling, were all wild yeast at one time that were just out there. I always like the story of how we think, humans first got into fermented beverages was just grain that had got some wild yeast and fermented, and they drank it and figured out they liked it. But with those selections, we've now, over thousands of years, selected certain yeast for different flavor profiles. So we're selecting a yeast that's been used for whiskey and actual bourbon production. So this is a bourbon yeast, and then we're doing some unique things with it. So we control the pitch rate. So that's how much yeast we're putting into solution. So that can affect overall flavor. So if we don't put enough, we can actually have competing other microbes like bacteria and stuff get in there and actually throw off flavors and cause problems. Also can affect your yield and have less yield because of bacteria eating that sugar. For us, we're more worried about off flavors that could cause. We pitch too much, you can actually get some off flavors from the yeast on the other side of it. So getting the pitch rate right, oxygenation as well into the mash, the right amount of oxygen to feed those yeast. All that as well with the temperature. So temperature selection there is going to determine it. We do some unique things here at Mystic where we don't, like a brewery, set one set temperature. We're actually doing more of a traditional whiskey fermentation where we're actually going through a wide variety of temperatures. And at different temperatures, we're going to get different fermentation profiles and different flavors. So throughout that fermentation as we're going, and we're doing a little bit longer of a fermentation, probably about 2 to 3 times longer than a bigger bourbon distillery. But by doing that, we're gonna get through the whole temperature phase, and then we're gonna almost get into like a lagering phase. So this is like you would lager a beer. After primary fermentation, we're going to a secondary fermentation. And the yeast are then able to keep acting on there. They're actually pulling out other compounds, reforming them, smoothing out the overall beer, the distiller's beer. A lot of the times there's sulfur compounds that can produce in a fermentation, and they're actually the yeast are gonna reabsorb those sulfur compounds, pull them out of solution. And this is something we were traditionally, when we started, we were doing a typical 3 to 5 day fermentation, the typical like everyone was doing, and we had a batch that literally just did not get run over Christmas. So it was like we took Christmas break, it didn't get run. We came back, ran at the first of the year, and it was some of the best tasting whiskey we'd ever tried. And so that kind of led us down that route, and I'd already had that beer experience, knew about lagering, knew what the yeast were doing. And so once we kind of discovered that, that's when we went to that longer fermentation, started getting that more complex flavor profile. Last little selection we got to do there with the yeast is also the amount of sugar in that solution. So if we do a 3% alcohol kind of beer compared to a 9% or 10%, it does affect the overall flavor of everything as well. So that's that kind of like last little knob we get to play with fermentation. But over the years, I think we're really lucky in that we did not have millions of dollars to ramp up and produce a lot of that early whiskey that we were first making those first barrels. We kind of learned and kind of got up and going as we learned and kind of refined it. And that's why I feel now we're making some of the best distillate that then goes into barrels and turns into bourbon, because we had that experience to learn things the weird and the accidental way, which sometimes is the best way.
Yeah, one thing that we do that I think is incredibly important is we do a single cooling process, and it's continuous. So we'll come out of that mash cooker at around 190 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're gonna drop that temperature all the way to 80, which is where we go into the fermenter, and that happens continuously. So you basically have a sterile mash that's getting cooled down, and it's going into a sterilized fermenter with the proper pitch rate, with only the yeast that we've wanted to introduce to that. There's very little chance for any sort of bacterial contamination or anything like that. And as Mike said, we're going through a range of temperatures. So we're gonna go in that fermenter at 80, and we've done testing where it goes all the way up to 102, 103 degrees, and then it naturally comes back down. And what's happening is we're getting a range of aromas and flavors created as that yeast goes through the different temperature stages. And that's what gives us, I think, a lot of that range of aroma and flavor that's coming through, and it gives you the richness of the nose and the depth of the fatty acids that give you that long finish. And I think a lot of places, they started out as brewers. They had big stainless steel glycol jacketed fermenters so they could control that temperature within 1/10 of a degree all the way around. And the next thing you know, you got this one-note whiskey, and it's really boring. But with beer, you can't take those kind of chances because there's no cuts. So whatever that ends up as, that's your beer.
That's your flavor.
And so brewing has become almost too precise to be a feedstock for bourbon production. And so not having the budget has actually really helped us.
And the weirdest way, yeah, not doing that. And we play we play around a little bit just to get that kind of curve that we like, and we played around with that fermentation curve. The other thing we like is actually having our plastic fermenters helps actually dissipate a lot of the heat for us. So if we moved over to stainless, we would have to adjust some things in process to kind of make it the same. And then the other thing we're doing here is we basically are doing the same kind of process as brewing. So we're doing the same cleaning, fermentation. We're in a closed vessel. So again, only getting the yeast, because we're doing that longer fermentation. A lot of times you'll see in Kentucky, especially, you'll see these big wood vats, and they'll be open. There'll be flies flying in it, because they're gonna run that fermentation 3 to 5 days. By the time any bacteria from that fly that landed in that mash got there and it even started making anything, it's already been distilled before you would even taste any off flavor. So they really treat cleaning fermentation as more of a wash down and situation, because they're just such a fast fermentation. But we're going very much like beer, where we can go a longer fermentation because we're totally sanitary throughout the whole process, all up to fermentation.
Yeah, and I think it comes from a lot of that not being concerned with throughput philosophy. So we're only doing 2 mashes a week, and each one of those is going to yield about 3 1/3 barrels. So we're not under the gun to make a huge amount of product. What we're trying to do is make absolutely the best product there is. So when it came time to say, okay, well, if we go an extra 10 or 6 days on our fermentation, we weren't like, oh, what's that gonna do to our throughput? What's that gonna do to our process? We're like, hey, this makes a much better product. We're doing that. Yeah. And that's what we really care about.
I think it'd be hard for a bigger distiller to do that with the current process. They're talking about double or tripling the amount of fermentation space they now have to have. That's now tens of millions of dollars of upfront capital. And then the time cost also to set out there, they're gonna look at that, and it's gonna be very hard to convince some bean counter and Jim Beam to do a 2 or 3x time fermentation. So I think we, as a small scale, have that advantage and can beat them where it matters and show consumers there is a value just spending that extra time and extra money early on in the process.
I think the other piece of this is we don't come into it with a whole lot of preconceived notions. I mean, Mike understands a lot of the brewery science that goes into it, but it wasn't like we graduated from a distilling program. You know, we came at this sort of sideways, and some of it is because we didn't have all of these fixed beliefs about how things would work. We just said, okay, well, we may be going in at the wrong temperature. We may not be going in at the wrong temperature. Let's do a batch and go in at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 75, 80, 85, 90, and we'll see what the different product is. Plus, we'll stick a bunch of thermocouples down inside the fermenter and see where the temperatures go. And that's how we arrived at 80. So it was sort of a scientific process, but without the preconceived notions. And then, as Mike said, going that extra week was really just a matter of, oh my God, this is so much better. Why wouldn't we do this? Yeah. And having the luxury to do that. And we don't answer to a bunch of investors, and we answer to our wives. So that's very important. Yeah. But they're not as concerned with throughput either. Their attitude is we're too small to compete on efficiency. So what we're going to compete on is overall quality.
Yeah. We're never going to be able to offer a $25 bottle of bourbon across the country. There's no way, it's impossible.
Well, and I mean, I think that if that's what you want, there's plenty of places to get that.
We could make it for you, but we would not want to drink it ourselves, so we're not going to make it.